Welcome back to the most electrifying channel on YouTube. Maybe. Probably not. But welcome back just the same. We have a doozy of a video today that's going to be quite controversial. But it's a video that someone has to make. I have found a hill to die on, and I'm going to deliver the defense of Thomas Jefferson, 3rd President of the United States. But before we get to that, I have to ask, do you know what Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson and I have in common? It's something that we have both done, almost certainly have not. Give up. We have both hired the design services of Paul Garner. Dewey used him to design a cracked magazine for his show, Young Rock. There is little Dewey excitedly reading the magazine and the show, though I'm sure that inside it's all Action Cat comics, done by Paul, who is also responsible for the graphics I'm using for this channel. See this logo? This logo? Oh, and my title banner, of course. Thanks to him, of course, and I'm extremely happy with the results. I'm now a cartoon, perhaps one day leading to some merchandising. Should I be shouting him out on my highly controversial video? Well, that's what he requested, so that's what he's getting. If you would also like to use his services yourself for whatever your graphical needs, head to his website, www.paulartifice.com. But back to Jefferson. He was once a beloved president and founding father, and would argue the best ideologically of all our presidents. Though that is not a high bar at all. Our presidents have tended to be exceptionally right-wing, from Washington to Biden. But perhaps a decade ago, Jefferson began to be popularly maligned. Texas struggled to remove him from textbooks a decade prior because of his deism. But Jefferson began to be maligned more than any other president in history because of two things. First, he owned slaves. And second, his relationship with Sally Hemmings. Neither of these things are defensible, but Jefferson's role in them is actually quite defensible. The attacks upon Jefferson's character are built upon liberal individualism. But we cannot simply judge Jefferson as a person honestly by looking at what we know today, even what we simply take as granted without knowing the details, and judge Jefferson based on if he had a role in things that were good or bad. Rather, we must analyze Jefferson in the context of the political, economic, and social systems of which he was part. Slavery was not simply the result of bad individuals existing, but the result of systemic forces. If we look to Marx's capital worker dialectic, or the more famous and applicable Hegel's master-slave dialectic, we are immediately informed that Jefferson was constrained by his relationship with systems which place him in that role. A socialist analysis of the situation is necessary for leftists to form any serious opinion. So we are going to look at things intellectually here, not through sound bites that provoke an emotional response. We are going to do critical thinking here. And this is extremely important to state because the very nature of this topic is going to prompt an urge inside you to simply react rather than think things out. And it's important to separate what is actually being argued from some broad brush it could be painted with. At no point am I going to be arguing that slavery was acceptable, nor that his relationship with Sally Hemmings was appropriate. I am going to be arguing that Jefferson's role in these things is personally excusable, not systemically excusable. This is something that requires a deep analysis, and so you have to keep your mind open and think critically about the arguments here. Wrestle with them, accept them or reject them, but do neither without engaging with them first. While slavery, especially chattel slavery, is absolutely morally wrong, the first question we have to ask ourselves is if Jefferson knew, or at least should be expected to have known, that slavery is morally wrong. If you have a button you can push, that every time you push that button, it dispenses a glass of beer for you. But unbeknownst to you, it also kills a child every time you push it. Are you morally culpable for pushing that button? Of course not. It was morally wrong to push the button, but you didn't know it, and so you are morally excused for doing so. We have to ask the same for Jefferson. Unfortunately for Jefferson, however, there are plenty of words which we can prove he was aware of and knew well the arguments behind them, which condemn slavery as moral evil. Here are a few examples. There must doubtless be an unhappy influence on the manners of our people produced by the existence of slavery among us. The whole commerce between master and slave is a perpetual exercise of the most boisterous passions, the most unremitting despotism on the one part, and degrading submissions on the other. What a stupendous, what an incomprehensible machine is man, who can endure toil, famine, stripes, imprisonment, or death itself in vindication of his own liberty, and the next moment be deaf to all those motives whose power supported him through his trial, and inflict on his fellow men a bondage, 1 hour of which is fraught with more misery than ages of that which he rose in rebellion to oppose. But we must await with patience the workings of an overruling providence, and hope that this is preparing the deliverance of these our suffering brethren. When the measure of their tears shall be full, when their groans shall have involved heaven itself in darkness, doubtless a God of justice will awaken to their distress, and by diffusing light and liberality among their oppressors, or at length by his exterminating thunder, manifest his attention to the things of this world, and that they are not left to the guidance of a blind fatality. I congratulate you, my dear friend, on the law of your state for suspending the importation of slaves, and for the glory you have justly acquired by endeavoring to prevent it forever. This abomination must have an end, and there is a superior bench reserved in heaven for those who hasten it. Whatever may have been the circumstances which influenced our forefathers to permit the introduction of personal bondage into any part of these states, and to participate in the wrongs committed on an unoffending quarter of the globe, we may rejoice that such circumstances and such sense of them exists no longer. That is definitely a sentiment against slavery in existence. But how do we know that Jefferson knew and understood these words? Because these are all words written by Jefferson himself. Jefferson knew that slavery was wrong, and perhaps better than any other free person in America at that time, as he was widely recognized as being the foremost abolitionist of his time. He was the crazy, radical kook that people didn't invite to political meetings because he is just going to rant about the evils of slavery. In fact, his original draft of the Declaration of Independence included a condemnation of slavery fueled by righteous indignation, which John Adams pragmatically had dropped from the text so that the southern states would get on board. This rant was more than 3 times as long as any other complaint against the king held for the end. He has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, or to incur miserable death on their transportation thither. This piratical warfare, the opprobrium of infidel powers, is the warfare of the Christian king of Great Britain, determined to keep an open market where men should be bought and sold. He has prostituted his negative for suppressing every legislative attempt to prohibit or to restrain execrable commerce, and that this assemblage of horrors might want no fact of distinguished dye, he is now exciting those very people to rise in arms among us, and to purchase that liberty of which he has deprived them, and murdering the people upon whom he also obtruded them, thus paying off former crimes committed against the liberties of one people with crimes which he urges them to commit against the lives of another. Jefferson even speaks on just how anti-slavery he was compared to others. There is nothing I would not sacrifice to a practicable plan of abolishing every vestige of this moral and political depravity. I can say with conscious truth that there is not a man on earth who would sacrifice more than I would to relieve us from this heavy reproach in any practicable way. The cession of that kind of property, for so it is misnamed, is a bagatelle which would not cost me a second thought if, in that way, a general emancipation and expatriation could be effected, and gradually, and with due sacrifices, I think it might be. But as if it is, we have the wolf by the ear, and we can neither hold him nor safely let him go. Justice is one scale, and self-preservation in the other. The abolition of the evil is not impossible. It ought never, therefore, be despaired of. Every plan should be adopted, every experiment tried, which may do something toward the ultimate object. Jefferson knew better, and knew better than anyone. So how does a man who is so adamantly opposed to slavery end up owning slaves? If you are so opposed to slavery, why in the world would you buy slaves? He inherited 40 slaves from his father in 1764, and then another 135 from his father-in-law in 1774. Apparently, he did purchase fewer than 20 people during his lifetime for the purposes of meeting labor needs and uniting spouses, according to Monticello. That would be the scholars working at Monticello currently, not his own records from way back when. And we will go into that inheritance more. But let us first discuss what kind of slave owner Jefferson was. He participated in the atrocity, and he tried to be a relatively benevolent slave owner, while still being a slave owner. My opinion has ever been that until more can be done for them, we should endeavor with those whom fortune has thrown on our hands to feed and clothe them well, to protect them from ill usage, require such reasonable labor only as it is performed voluntarily by free men, and be led by no repugnancies to abdicate them and our duties to them. Jefferson is saying that he felt constrained by a slave system in America, and so he could not simply free them. But his stance was that he would endeavor to create as comparable a life to them as if they were freed. They would get the same kind of pay as proletarian workers and work no more than proletarian workers in work that those free workers would have also been willing to do. He couldn't grant them everything that free workers had. They couldn't be educated nor leave when they wanted, but he could not provide that. However, Monticello itself disagrees, saying that he was a rather typical slave owner of the time. He did have physical punishment administered, and despite his stated opposition to selling any except for delinquency or on their request, he did sell 110 slaves, mainly for financial reasons. At least 3 were sold at their own request, and 85 were gifted to family members or used to pay dowries. He did free 10, 5 at his death, 2 during his life, and he allowed 3 to run away without pursuit, all from the Hemmings family. Meanwhile, Jefferson struggled with racism. Despite bemoaning slavery, he spent most of his life feeling that black people were inferior to white people. In 1788, he wrote in his Notes on the State of Virginia, "But never yet could I find that a black had uttered a thought above the level of plain narration, never seen an elementary trait of painting or sculpture. In music, they are more generally gifted than the whites with accurate ears for tune and time, and they have been found capable of imagining a small catch. Whether they will be equal to the composition of a more extensive run of melody or of complicated harmony is yet to be proved. Misery is often the parent of the most affecting touches in poetry. Among the blacks is misery enough, God knows, but no poetry. Love is the peculiar estrum of the poet. Their love is ardent, but it kindles the senses only, not the imagination." And then, "I advance it, therefore, as a suspicion only, that the blacks, whether originally a distinct race, or made distinct by time and circumstances, are inferior to the whites in the endowments of both body and mind." He was admonished by Benjamin Banneker, an academically accomplished free black man, on August 19, 1791. And I do want to stress that by academically accomplished, I mean that he had done things on his own, writing almanacs and such. Of course, especially in pre-Revolutionary War America, just right after the Revolutionary War America, you're not going to see a black man in academia, no matter how qualified he is. But Banneker was self-taught and still extremely accomplished, especially for being self-taught. This, sir, was a time in which you clearly saw into the injustice of a state of slavery, and in which you had just apprehensions of the horrors of its condition. It was now, sir, that your abhorrence thereof was so excited, that you publicly held forth this true and invaluable doctrine, which is worthy to be recorded and remembered in all succeeding ages. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Here, sir, was a time in which your tender feelings for yourselves had engaged you thus to declare you were then impressed with proper ideas of the great valuation of liberty and the free possession of those blessings to which you were entitled by nature. But, sir, how pitiable it is to reflect that although you were so fully convinced of the benevolence of the Father of mankind, and of his equal and impartial distribution of those rights and privileges which he had conferred upon them, that you should at the same time counteract his mercies in detaining by fraud and violence so numerous a part of my brethren under groaning captivity and cruel oppression, that you should at the same time be found guilty of that most criminal act which you professedly detested in others with respect to yourselves. Jefferson responded on August 30th. Nobody wishes more than I do to see proofs as you exhibit that nature has given to our black brethren talents equal to those of the other colors of men, and that the appearance of a want of them is owing merely to the degraded condition of the existence both in Africa and America. I can add with truth that nobody wishes more ardently to see a good system commence for raising the condition of both their body and mind to what it ought to be, as fast as the imbecility of their present existence and other circumstances, which cannot be neglected, will admit. In other words, Jefferson thought that Banneker was an outlier, and while he didn't like the racist implications he put forth in his notes on the state of Virginia, he actually noted shortly after the second excerpt that he feared that it would mean that white and freed blacks could not live together and it would end in violence. They still held them. It should be of note that Jefferson's opposition to slavery came straight from John Locke's second treatise, which stated that one man could only enslave another man when that man had entered a state of war with him, which amounted to them trying to place the other completely under their control to commit violence or theft. Someone had to initiate violence against you in order for you to be able to enslave them. That is not how men and women were enslaved in the African slave trade, nor on the plantation. Hence Jefferson's objection to the institution and his original admonition of King George. However, unlike the much lauded Abraham Lincoln, Jefferson seems to have finally come around on this issue by the end of his life, as he wished the condition of black people was the cause of their apparent inferiority, and it actually was. Jefferson came to embrace this belief, as he expressed in a letter to Henri Gregoire, dated February 25th, 1809. I have received the favor of your letter of August 17th, and with it the volume you were so kind as to send me on the literature of Negroes. Be assured that no person living wishes more sincerely than I do to see a complete refutation of the doubts I have myself entertained and expressed on the grade of understanding allotted to them by nature, and to find that in this respect they are on par with ourselves. My doubts were the result of personal observation on the limited sphere of my own state, where the opportunities for the development of their genius were not favorable, and those of exercising it still less so. I express them, therefore, with great hesitation, but whatever be their degree of talent, it is no measure of their rights, because Sir Isaac Newton was superior to others in understanding. He was not, therefore, lord of the person and property of others. On this subject, they are gaining daily in the opinions of nations, and hopeful advances are making towards their reestablishment on an equal footing with the other colors of the human family. I pray you, therefore, to accept my thanks for the many instances you have enabled me to observe of respectable intelligence in that race of men, which cannot fail to have effect in hastening the day of their relief. I'm happy to announce that we are done with the recitation of letters from this point on in the video. But what does all this tell us about Jefferson and slavery? He was recognized as the greatest abolitionist of his time, despite being torn between Lockean idealism and fears of retributive violence from those who had been wronged in the great evil of slavery. He had taken on slaves and had a moral and ethical code about his participation in the institution, a code which he failed to uphold. Yes, he seems to be the ideal illustration of Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel's master-slave dialectic. This later was transformed into Marx's capitalist worker dialectic. Just as the relationship constrains the actions of the slave, so does it constrain the actions of the master. The master, in this case Jefferson, is forced by the nature of the relationship to act in certain ways. Through the termination of the master-slave dynamic, both slave and master are freed. Yes, I am saying that Jefferson is the ideal expression of that dialectic. He was an idealist who thought that he could do it better, more ethically, but failed miserably at the task because he was constrained by the economics. No one could have been the ethical slave owner that Jefferson wanted to be. And note that his moral code included not working them any harder than a free worker and to provide a similar standard of living. His approach was to recreate life as a free man as best as he could within the constraints of the system, and he failed. As a Marxist, I am inclined to think that he was doomed to failure, just as any capitalist does, and just like you would if you were in Jefferson's shoes. That's right. Some of you right now are thinking about how you could have done it better. You couldn't have. Hell, you probably wouldn't be as opposed to slavery as Jefferson was back then, assuming you're right. You were wrong, and he was wrong, with the same delusions of white saviorism. Your friend who owns a company but is good to their employees, they aren't. They exploit their labor even if they aren't the worst, or even went to it idealistically. So this takes us back to Jefferson's inheritance of his first slaves. This is where we judge Jefferson, not by whether he exploited his slaves, he did, but by whether he's a bad person for owning slaves. What were Jefferson's options at the time, and what would the most likely consequences be? We aren't even going to consider their consequences to Jefferson and his family. We are only going to consider the consequences to black people, both enslaved and free. First, let us split this into 3 scenarios. 1. He refuses his inheritance. 2. He takes the slaves north and frees them there. 3. He spends the funds to ship his slaves back to Africa and frees them there. So what if Jefferson refuses inheritance from his father? What if he said that he will not be a slave owner right from the beginning? How does this affect black people? To be honest, I'm not even fully sure he had this option. I think he most likely could refuse the inheritance, but I'm no expert on inheritance law in colonial Virginia. I even reached out to Monticello before Christmas to inquire if they knew. They're historians specializing in this subject. They might know. I received no reply, but let us assume that he did have the option for this exercise. Slaves were expensive, very expensive. Today we look at houses and say they're very expensive, and if we are well off enough to get one, we don't just buy a house. We do so through a mortgage. Along with the slaves that Jefferson inherited, he also inherited similar debts along with them, which he was then obligated to pay off. If he refused the inheritance, they weren't just going to go free. The banks would never allow that. Perhaps another family member would inherit them, one that Jefferson would have thought was not going to be as benevolent as himself. Or the lawyer responsible for the transfer of the estate would be forced to find a way to pay off the banks. Slaves could be useful, but a bank has no use of slaves. And these were the dark days before Ally McBeal, where an attorney would necessarily be a man, would have to find buyers for the slaves. He is pressured to sell and has no incentive to get more for them than is owed to the bank. So he is going to sell them, breaking up families, and not a single one is going to end up being freed in the bargain. In fact, part of Jefferson's moral code as a slave owner was to not break up families. So this fact probably occurred to him. He grew up with these people, and he didn't want to see more harm done to them than was required systemically. Maybe excess would be offered to Jefferson, maybe not. The end result of him refusing inheritance, black people being split up from their families and the neighbors they knew, maybe harsher treatment under another relative. Either way, it's negative for the black people involved. So on to his second option. Having secured the slaves, he could, at least at some point in his life, taken them all north and free them upon free soil. Why didn't Jefferson do this if he hated slavery so much? Well, these slaves are still tied to debts that Jefferson owes. Debts worth more than the brick and mortar of Monticello itself. Debts he owes to banks who are going to still be influential in the government. Stop thinking in a liberal mindset where every interaction happens in a vacuum. There are systemic forces in play in the real world, including the real world in which Jefferson lived. It isn't just Jefferson enforcing slavery, there's an entire society enforcing slavery and forcing Jefferson's hand. That system says the banks need to get their money. Now, what is that system going to do? Well, there is a provision in the U.S. Constitution, Article 4, Section 2, Clause 3, known as the Fugitive Slave Clause. No person held of service or labor in one state, under the laws thereof, escaping into another, shall in consequence of any law or regulation therein be discharged from service or labor, but shall be delivered up on claim of the party to whom such service or labor may be due. It would not be a reach for a court to determine that Jefferson had no right to free his slaves because there was a debt attached and a bank forcing the recapture of those that had been freed. The capture of slaves in the North is an established phenomenon. They also weren't that particular in the recapture. You might be familiar with the movie 12 Years a Slave. They would grab anyone who met the description and say they are the runaway slave being sought. You also have the likelihood that in figuring out how many are to be reobtained and resold, they are going to factor in the costs of recapture. Some of those who were freed may very well remain free, but other black people are going to be shipped down south in their place. Families will be broken up first from the wrong people being taken and in the resale. Once again, the net effect is a negative result for black people. Thus is systemic oppression. Now, option 3. He takes them to Africa. After all, that is what Jefferson thought the solution to the slavery problem. What happens then? Well, we can assume that this plays out much like the last scenario. The bank demands their money and a court authorizes recapture. It isn't a slave trade if you're recapturing those who were already enslaved, and maybe he does even does this before the Constitution is signed banning a slave trade. They also aren't very particular and careful of details. They will just grab any black person and declare them to be the person, even if they don't speak English. They also might save the trouble by deciding that they all took another ship back to America, or that Jefferson never actually took them to Africa. Let's be honest, the same courts that laughed Jefferson off as a young man when he took on 6 cases of runaway slaves, all pro bono and paying the filing fees himself, were not going to question much about the story. Perhaps the actual originally enslaved black people would remain free forever, but others would be taken in their place. Liberia didn't exist until 1822, 4 years before Jefferson's death, so they likely would have found themselves in a land that spoke a foreign language. This is assuming that they would even be accepted at some village rather than a European-controlled port that would promptly take action to recapture them. Once again, the result for black people is a negative result, even if some individual black people might be better off. It seems that what Jefferson intended to do, even if he failed to do so, was the best realistically possible result for black people. Even with his failure to uphold his ideals, it was probably the best actual result for black people. That is a horrific prospect that leaves no joy in what a horrible fact of the matter is, but the truth being unsatisfying doesn't negate its truthfulness. Working within the constraints of a slave society, Jefferson could do no better. We can look back and criticize his stance that white and black people couldn't live together after abolition. We can criticize the racism that he held and expressed through most of his life. But the big criticism that we are addressing is that he was a slave owner. That is the criticism that people levy against him. In doing so, we bundle our outrage at the system of slavery, particularly chattel slavery, with those with relative power who participated in that system. Our outrage is justified, but bundling it upon Jefferson is not. But what then about Sally Hemmings? Among the slaves that Jefferson inherited from his father-in-law was Sally Hemmings, the offspring of John Wales and one of his slaves, Elizabeth Hemmings, in 1773. That is ambiguous. Was I saying that she was born in 1773 or that Jefferson inherited her in 1773? The answer is yes. Both are true. Jefferson's wife, Martha, died in 1782, in the months following the birth of their last child, Elizabeth, apparently never recovering from the birth. The child died 2 years later of whooping cough. Jefferson is said to have spent weeks in seclusion following her death, distraught from the loss. In 1787, a 14-year-old Sally Hemmings was chosen by Jefferson's sister-in-law to accompany his daughter Maria, baptized as Mary and nicknamed Polly, to Paris, where Jefferson was serving as the ambassador to France. According to her son, or rather their son, Madison, while Hemmings was serving as a handmaiden for Maria and accompanying her to social events, she also became a concubine to Jefferson while there. Presumably, this was at some point before when she, at 16, stood there as a free woman in France, trained to speak French, was talked into returning to slavery at Monticello in return for special privileges and freedom for their future children. Now, there is no doubt that Sally Hemmings was incapable of consenting to Thomas Jefferson. It is likely the relationship started before she was 16, which is the lowest current age of consent in the United States. So we can say that she was too young to consent to sexual relations with an adult. Whether or not Jefferson forced her at any point, she would still be under the habit of listening to adults. Beyond this, though she may have technically been free in France, Jefferson was her master, someone always to be obeyed, and still her employer if we were to consider her free at the time. She could not give meaningful consent. Even if someone argued that she was 16 before they copulated, the first evidence of the relationship was that she returned to Virginia pregnant and was technically free at the time. Being raised with Jefferson as her master is enough for her to be incapable of consent. She was raped whether or not she was aware of it. The relationship was not acceptable knowing what we know now. Pay attention to those words though. Knowing what we know now. While we can condemn Jefferson's relationship with Sally rightfully, can we condemn Jefferson for his part in this? Did he know what he was doing was wrong? That may seem like an odd question to ask in today's world, but imagine your car has been rigged. Every time you turn on its ignition, a signal is sent to a kennel and a puppy is killed. You starting your car kills a puppy every time. But you don't know that. Are you a monster? Of course not. And if we are seeking to judge Jefferson, we must also consider what he knew and what he didn't know. The relationship was toxic, but that doesn't mean that Jefferson was at fault. But before we go there, we should ask if both parties may have thought they were in love. On Jefferson's part, he was torn up by the death of his wife. It seems possible that his half-sister may share certain features with her. Sure, he would not consciously confuse the two, but subconsciously he may have projected his wife onto the young Sally. He may have projected the love he held for Martha onto Sally, and there's no reason that Sally couldn't have further charmed him, unintentionally, with her own virtues. The story of him begging her to return to Monticello certainly speaks to his feeling some serious emotions, especially since he followed through on his promises even though no one could hold him to account. As for Sally, she could have walked away in France. And we know that she knew that she could have walked away because she was actively telling Jefferson that she was going to do so. She was old enough while living in Monticello to know what happened there. And yet his professions of love managed to sway her. She may not have actually loved him back. She was 16 and with a man who was powerful in her life and powerful in the world outside of it. But a 16-year-old can absolutely think they are in love. It may be puppy love, but it is powerful to a 16-year-old. It was powerful enough to have her stay. So we can think that the bulk of the relationship likely mimicked a consensual relationship. So while we know that a 14-year-old or a 15-year-old cannot consent, and for some people it's not until 18, and I've even heard it claimed that one cannot consent until 26. Did Jefferson know she could not consent? He was an intelligent man. He should have known that, right? Well, this is happening between 1787 and 1789. The first statutory rape laws in the English context date back to 1275, when the Statute of Westminster of 1275 determined it was unlawful to lay with a girl until the age of 12. In 1576, this age was lowered to 10. Not working in the right direction there. The American colonies transferred this to their common law with ages between 10 and 12. What's more, none of this had anything to do with the ability of a young girl to consent to the contact. It had to do with patriarchal obsession with chastity and nothing more. That is why it was tried as a property crime and a valid defense was that the child was already sexually experienced and thus already impure. In fact, it was not until just over 100 years after Jefferson's rape of Sally Hemmings in the 1890s that Victorian-era social purity reformers managed to have the age raised between 14 and 16, depending on the state. Because this was how old they would have to be to give meaningful consent, right? Nope. Because it was wrong to expect a woman to remain chaste until marriage, but allow for men to have sex with them before that age. It's a lot less patriarchal than before, but still not about consent. England had beaten us to that in 1885. In fact, it was not until the 1970s and 80s that feminists made it about consent by requiring an age gap between participants for it to be a felony, and making it so that boys could be legally considered to be raped as well. This information came from Chapter 1 of a book either entitled Jailbait or Statutory Rape Laws in a Historical Context. The chapter is entitled The Other. I accessed it through SUNY, an educational institution. You can see the link below. Yep, that's right. It would have been legal for a grown woman to rape a 12-year-old boy before that. And if two straight 13-year-olds lost their virginity together, it was always the boy that raped the girl, by statute. As to consent, in 1895, a Kentucky legislator defended the status quo, writing, "I regard the 12-year-old girl as being capable of resisting the wiles of the seducer as any older woman." So, should Jefferson have had the sociological understanding developed nearly 200 years later to understand that what he was doing was rape? Should Jefferson have been aware of power dynamics and the relationship to consent? He was a Lockean who apparently was fine with John Locke's arguments of tacit consent, where you agree to the government's rule by not removing yourself from its borders. I don't think he was hip to the argument of second-wave feminists in the future. We must excuse Thomas Jefferson for his rape of Sally Hemmings because he could not have known better. There are two major modern criticisms of Thomas Jefferson. He was a slave owner and that he raped Sally Hemmings. Under our current understanding, I believe I have sufficiently defended Thomas Jefferson, the man, here from these accusations. That doesn't mean he is flawless by any means. There are numerous things for which we can rightfully criticize Jefferson. Take, for example, his Lockean dismissal of American Indians and their way of life. He wasn't like Jackson, wanting to wage war against them, but he did insist upon changing them to agricultural societies so that they would sell their lands. Locke had argued that a person who fenced off an acre of land and developed it was giving mankind 9 acres because of increased efficiency. They'd be using 10 otherwise. However, we can certainly admire his desire to become one people with them, even if he assumed that they would simply adopt American culture. However, yet again, when American Indians refused assimilation, he advocated for and initiated Indian removal from the East Coast to the Arkansas Territory. This is ethnic cleansing, a form of genocide, though yet again a concept which did not yet exist. At the same time, Jefferson seemed radically for the common person compared to modern politicians and his contemporaries, through those same Lockean influences. For example, we can look to his bemoaning of the extent of property rights, claiming whenever there is in any country uncultivated lands and unemployed poor, it is clear that the laws of property have been so far extended as to violate natural right. The earth is given as a common stock to man to labor and live on. Jefferson was a paradoxical man who held high ideals that he failed to live up to due to pragmatic concerns. He seemed reluctant to do so, but he ultimately acquiesced to pragmatism, time and time again. But more importantly, he is a tale of caution. When we have an exploitative system in place, whether slavery or colonialism, or dare I suggest capitalism, he has shown the fruitlessness in trying to reform the system rather than uprooting and replacing it. So what are your thoughts? Having heard my explanation, do you see holes in my logic? Facts I may not be aware of? Angles I haven't considered? Just because I argue something doesn't mean that you should agree with my conclusions. Only carefully consider those arguments. So tell me below your thoughts. And of course, make sure you like the video, subscribe if you haven't already, hit that notification button if you want YouTube to tell you when I am releasing something new. I am doing some freeform streams. In addition to making the videos, gives a little bit more content. Not everything has to be this well thought out beforehand. I am going to probably do a few more coming up soon. And then I'm thinking I may take another shot at doing a video do Hobbes. The educational video. I'm going to see what I can get there. Do the philosophy of Thomas Hobbes. See how that does. We'll see if we'll move on to Locke there. Of course, in those educational videos, I am much more neutral in things. And it's about purely the education in those. Whereas a video like this one, I was much more forceful in putting my own views out there. I'm advocating for something, in this case, not attacking Thomas Jefferson as a person for what he did, but rather only attacking what he has done. And by all means, if you do that in today's day and age, what he did back then, you should know better. We have come much further along than they were in the 1700s. You should know better. You should not be trying to own slaves or having sex with underage girls or boys or somebody who doesn't identify as neither. Stay away from that. But other than that, I think we are all set for today. So have a good day and see you later.